good to see everyone that's here tonight. As was announced, tonight we will take and finish our study in the 21st chapter of the book of Acts. After closing his record of Paul's second journey in Acts, the 18th chapter, verse 22, the very next chapter, he immediately begins his study or his recording of Paul's third journey in the verse 23. As Paul turns once again towards Jerusalem, he also turns his attention to taking the gospel all the way to the city of Rome. Now, Luke will continue to record the events that eventually lead to the arrival of Paul in Rome in Acts, the 28th chapter, verse 16, but it may not be exactly what he expected to take or how he expected to eventually arrive there. Now, in our study tonight, I think there's a challenge for us. A challenge for this section is whether we can recognize the providential hand of God behind what happens, because what doesn't happen in this chapter or this part of the chapter, in other places, it did happen. So we will take and notice that as we come through to it. So beginning in verse 21, and I will be reading from the King James Version. Now there's one verse where we will go to the New English translation just for that verse to take and have a comparison between the two translations. After these things were ended, Paul proposed in the Spirit when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. So he sent unto Macedonia two of them that ministered unto him, Timotheus or Timothy, and Erastus, but he himself stayed in Asia for a season. Now, there is disagreement exactly what Paul means when he says that he purposed in the Spirit. Does the Spirit there mean being spelled with a small s mean that it's talking about Paul's own spirit? The American Standard Version, the New English Translation, the New International Version, the New Century Version, and the King James Version, and others translated like that. You'll see it spelled with a small s. Or does it mean the Holy Spirit spelled with a large S or a capital S? The English Standard Version, the New American Standard Version, the Revised Standard Version, Young's Little Translation, and the New King James Version all spell it like that. Now, one thing I do know that Paul has learned to take and surround his purposes first in consideration what the Holy Spirit wants him to do. In fact, you can take and read that concern when he's talking about Aquila and Priscilla in Acts the 18th chapter, verse 21, and bade them farewell. He's talking, as I said, about Aquila and Priscilla, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem, but I will return again unto you if God will. And he sailed from Ephesus in Acts the 18th chapter, verse 21. Now, according to Acts the 20th chapter, verse 31, Paul was at Ephesus for approximately 3 years, which is one of the longest stays recorded anywhere in the book of Acts of where he stayed and where he preached. Now, by the time of the writing of Revelation, Ephesus had left her first love in Revelation, the 2nd chapter, verse 4. Now, think about that. We're roughly somewhere in AD 50. Revelation is written one generation later. Now, how many of the people that Paul or Luke is speaking of here are still alive at that time? We don't know. But we do know the next generation does have a problem. Now, did they not do a good job in training the children and indoctrinating the children and teaching the children? Something has happened. Something is not exactly right. Now, one of the things that we'll see again tonight, Ephesus, the immorality that went on Ephesus at this time. Obviously, it began to have some effect upon the next generation. Now, passing through Macedonia and Achaia, and then going to Jerusalem was for a purpose. Paul was collecting money from the more prosperous Christians in the Aegean region and wanted to deliver it to Judah. Now we read, for it hath pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. It hath pleased them verily, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister unto them carnal things. Now, Paul is saying this in Romans, the 15th chapter, verses 26 and verse 27. And then he says in 1 Corinthians, the 16th chapter, verse 1, which we often hear quoted, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Now, Paul is aware that it can be very dangerous for him to take and go back to Jerusalem. Now, remember in Acts, the 9th chapter, verse 23 through 25, the Jews wanted to kill him. And to take and save his life, they let him down by a basket on the outside of the wall. And so it's very iffy, if you will, for him to take and return there and think that he will not meet quite a bit of opposition at that time. But nonetheless, he has resolved that he is going. Now, to the Roman brethren, he wrote this. Now I beseech you, brethren, for the Lord Jesus Christ's sake, and for the love of the Spirit, that ye strive together with me in your prayers to God for me. Then he says in verse 31, that I may be delivered from them that do not believe in Judea, and that my service which I have for Jerusalem may be acceptable of the saints, that I may come unto you with joy by the will of God, and may with you be refreshed. That's Romans the 15th chapter, verses 30 through 32. Now, Timothy and Erastus. Timothy, we know. We've met him several times already in the book of Acts. But this is the first mention of Erastus. Now, these two helpers, these two were helpers in the same manner that John Mark had been, at least for a period back and earlier in the book of Acts. Now, Timothy, as I said, we know this is the first mention of Erastus, and as we go into chapter 20, we'll find there's another list of people that it's the first time they're mentioned, although we find that they were workers and travelers with Paul. In Romans the 16th chapter, verse 23, Gaius, my host, and the whole city, the whole church saluteth you. Erastus, the chambermaid, or the treasurer of the city of Corinth, of the city saluteth you, and Quartus, a brother. Now, is this the same Gaius? Now, you're going to find commentators disagree on this. Some believe that he is, some believe that he cannot be. In 2 Timothy, the 4th chapter, verse 20, Erastus abode at Corinth, but Trophimus have I left in Miletum sick. Now, while Paul lingers a while in Asia, he sends these two workers out ahead of him. Now, there's possibly two reasons that he does it. Number one, by sending them out, because of their close association with Paul, there would be less opposition to the Christians in that area if they were not there as well as Paul. Or he just may be sending them out ahead so that they kind of prepare these churches for Paul's coming. Now, this is another example of what frequently happens even today when there is no giving or compromise between the Lord's way and what is popular in the society. As Christianity spread, interest in Artemis, and as we will take and see, beginning with verse 23. At the same hour there arose no small stir about that way. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, which made silver swines for Diana, or Artemis, if you will. Diana is the Roman name, Artemis is the Ephesian name, brought no small gain unto the craftsmen. Now, as Christianity spread, interest in Artemis and the market for her statues began to take a decline. And these artisans who were apparently getting wealthy off of this began to notice that they could not produce as much as they could before. Now, this is how Paul describes this disturbance. If after the manner of men I have fought with beasts at Ephesus. He said this in 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter, and verse 32. Now, the word beast there comes from a Greek word. It's defined to be a beast fighter in in the gladiator shows. In other words, figuratively, to encounter furious men is the way the Strong defines this word. Bullinger says to fight wild beasts like condemned prisoners in the public spectacle. Now, Paul is painting himself as a gladiator or someone is being surrounded by these wild beasts and that he is having to fight them all. Now, Demetrius was a man who worked with silver, and in this case, he made a small portable temples or buildings depicting the temple of the goddess Artemis, and may even have contained a silver image as part of the building. Now, as the people were deeply attached to the temple and worship of Artemis, the silversmiths were deeply attached to the money they made off of the temple. In these words, we can see trouble coming. Next, we see a false claim and an exaggeration on the part of Demetrius, beginning with verse 25, whom he called together with the workmen of like occupation and said, Sirs, we know that by this craft we have our wealth. Moreover, ye see and hear that not alone at Ephesus, but also throughout all Asia, that this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that they be no gods which are made with hands, so that not only this our craft is in danger to be set at naught, but also that the temple of the great goddess Diana should be despised, and her magnificence should be destroyed, with whom all of Asia and the world worship. Now, Demetrius calls a meeting of the people of like craft. Now, you'll find that many commentators will say, well, this is a version of the early trade unions. With the weakening of their business by the conversion of many to the faith, Demetrius means to put pressure on Paul in his preaching to not be as vocal and certainly not to preach these things. What better way is there to prejudice others' minds than to tell them that the source of their wealth is what is under threat? Now, the strangest thing about this incident is that everything he charged Paul with, for the most part, is true. When Paul preached that there is no God that mankind can make with his hands, they understood that Artemis was a man-made god. And obviously, what he was saying was true. Now, Paul's preaching was a threat because every convert was one less person buying a shrine, and Paul was having no small success in his preaching. Now, here's an interesting note. The Greek word translated as craft in verse 25 is the same Greek word translated as gain in Acts the 16th chapter, verse 19, as well as Acts 19th chapter, verse 24, and work in Ephesians the 4th chapter and verse 19. Now let me talk a little bit about this temple of Artemis. The temple that Paul comes and sees on that day or at that time, it's a magnificent temple. It is, if you study history, you've probably been told this in school, it's one of the 7 wonders of the world. But you know, this is not the largest temple. There was actually a larger temple than this at one time. But about 300 BC, an arsonist destroyed that temple. This is actually a rebuilt temple. So let me compare this temple with you, if you will, with that of the Parthenon. The Parthenon was about 229 feet long and 98 feet wide, a little over, well, it's about, if you look at a football field, standing at the end zone, it's at as long as the 30-yard line at the other end. As I said, it's 98 feet wide. The 46 outer colonnades are 34 feet high. Now, the temple that Paul saw, listen to this, was one of the largest marble temples ever constructed at 337 feet long and 144 feet wide. The 127 colonnades were 60 feet tall. The temple that Paul saw, as I said, was a rebuilt temple from a larger temple. So what we find here is a temple that is over a football field long. Its columns are higher. In fact, I've read that 4 Parthenons, as far as volume is concerned, could fit inside of this temple that that is at Ephesus. Another thing about this temple was that, or adding to its value and reputation, was that it was a it was the treasury in which much of the wealth of the Western Asia is where it was stored. Now, probably no religious building in the world had more admiration, more enthusiasm, and more superstition concentrated on it than this one temple. Now, notice there is no consideration as to what is right and wrong from the evidence. In other words, the special miracles that we read of in verse 11 that God provided before them. Demetrius was trying to fan the flames and his accusations by overstressing the claim that all of Asia and the world worshipped Artemis. Even so, Demetrius correctly represented the drift of Paul's teaching when he said he was preaching against the idolatrous worship that was at Artemis. Now, somebody has got to pay for this. In verse 29, and when they heard these sayings, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, "Great is Diane of the Ephesians." Now, this is not the only time this chapter is going to talk about what they said. Apparently, this is a short version of it. Later on, they're going to be shouting this out for a couple of hours. And the whole city was filled with confusion. And having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theater. Now, full of anger, that this hysterical crowd starts to chant, "Great is Diane," or if you will, Artemis of the Ephesians. Now, note, it is a lot easier to buy someone's mind if you have a good slogan. And we see this every time on TV when you find two groups that takes and they're holding a meeting or something like this, and they start opposing each other. Listen to them start chanting. They each have their own version of it. Now, ironically, many of the protesters did not even know what they were talking about or what was the issue or what was going on at this time. The mob catches two men of Macedonia that they know that are part of that way or the way, in other words, that they were Christians. The two men are Gaius and Aristarchus. This Gaius is from Macedonia and therefore cannot be the one from Corinth in 1 Corinthians, the first chapter and verse 14, nor the one from Derbe in Acts the 20th chapter and verse 4. Apparently he came over the Aegean Sea with Paul, Priscilla, and Aquila on Paul's second tour. Now, Aristarchus is mentioned also in chapter 20 and verse 4, as well as chapter 27 and verse 2. Now, the theater in Ephesus is an interesting deal itself. If you check on the internet, it still exists. It's still in pretty good shape. In fact, it would be something that would be nice if you had a play or something like that to go to this theater, because this theater is pointed to the ocean. It has 3 tiers to it. It could hold 24,000 seats and had room for 1,000 people to stand. Now, let me give you some idea of the size of this theater. As I said, it's well preserved. It is built of marble on the slope of a hill facing out to sea. It was 490 feet in diameter. It had 62 rows of seats divided by 2 walkways between the tiers of seats. And we see that in our own stadiums today. There's a walkway here and a walkway here. Now, if you look at the picture there, naturally the bottom row is a semicircle, and it's the shorter row. The next row, the second row, you'll find that the walkways, every other one lines up with the seat or the walkway in the row below it. Now, as I said, it accommodated 25,000 people. Now, let me give you a perspective of what this means. The 25,000 people are 29% of OU's Gaylord Family Stadium that holds 86,102. Now, let me be politically correct, and I'll tell you about OSU. Oh, it's 42% of OSU's Boone Pickens Stadium today, which holds 60,000. Now, the one thing that OSU has over OSU is the older stadium. In fact, OSU Stadium is the oldest stadium in the Big 12. It beat the OU Stadium by 3 years. Now, there's mass confusion. Verse 30, and when Paul would have entered in unto the people, the disciples suffered him not. And certain of the chief of Asia, which were his friends, sent unto him, desiring him that he would not adventure himself into the theater. Some therefore cried one thing, and some another. For the assembly was confused, and the more part knew not wherefore they were come together. Now, question: what is the Jews' motive in drawing Alexander out of? We'll see that in just a minute. Knowing that the mob was likely to beat him to death, this local crowd prevented him from going in among these people. Now, one thing's probably for certain: he couldn't say these two anyway. All it would happen probably is that he would be beaten to death as well as these two. Now, Paul later would say this of his deliverance from death. For we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were pressed out of measure, above strength, insomuch that we despaired even of life. But we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God, which raiseth the dead, who delivered us from so great a death, and doth deliver, in whom we trust that he will yet deliver us. 2 Corinthians, the first chapter, verses 8 through 10. Now notice in verse 31, Paul has made friends even among the chief, even among the rulers, if you will, of that area. He did not keep a low profile, no matter who it was. He was willing to deliver to them the gospel if they were willing to hear, no matter their station in life. Now, the Greek word translated assembly here is interesting. It is the word that we are familiar with. It's the word ecclesia. And it's a normal translation of which is church. This illustrates the basic meaning of the word church, which is an assembly, a people called out of the mass for a special purpose. Now, the word church is going to appear one more time in this chapter, but it's going to be a different word with a different meaning. In verse 33, and they drew Alexander out of the multitude, that the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander beckoned with the hand and would have made his defense unto the people. But when they knew that he was a Jew, all with one voice, about the space of 2 hours, cried out, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. Now, what do you suppose their motivation was? These Jews had sent him out. This is the New English translation says this, and I find it rather interesting. Some of the crowd concluded it was about Alexander because the Jews had pushed him to the front. Alexander, gesturing with his hands, was wanting to make a defense before the public assembly. Now, apparently, in his opinion at least, or this translation's opinion, they thought it was Alexander that was the one that was causing the trouble, or it was all about him. But we know that that is not true. The people did not let him speak, so we have no idea exactly what he would have said on this occasion. In any case, the Jews wanted it understood that even though Paul was a Jew, the reduction in Artemis's idol business was not their fault. So far, this mob is making no distinction between Christianity and Judaism because both of them opposed idolatry. The result is that, at least for a moment, attention is drawn away from Gaius and Aristarchus as the mob takes up this chant for 2 hours, Great is Diane of the Ephesians. Now, a very, very important man now comes on scene. In verse 35, and when the town clerk had appeased the people, he said, Ye men of Ephesus, what man is there that knoweth not how that the city of the Ephesians is a worshiper of the great goddess Diane and of the image which fell down from Jupiter. Seeing then that these things cannot be spoken against, you ought to be quiet and to do nothing rash. Now, how important is this man? You know, in studying this, you'll find that this man is very, very, very important. There's only one other man that's higher up or higher in rank than he is, and that's the proconsul. And so he has come out there, and naturally, when he starts speaking, the people hush. There could be a big price to take and pay. And now we'll find that he will take and he will give four reasons why they need to take and do something different than what they're doing right now. Now, Vincent says the town clerk or recorder who had charge of the city archives and whose duty it was to draw up official decrees and present them to assemblies of the people next to the commander or the proconsul, if you will, he was the most important personage in the Greek free cities. The Greek word for town clerk here, it comes from a Greek word, is defined as the same word translated as scribe in the Gospels. For example, and there's many examples, Matthew, the 2nd chapter, verse 4, as well as Matthew, the 7th chapter, and verse 29. Now, this does not do justice, as I said, to the man's position. We think of a town clerk today, who's he? What importance is he? When he talks, nobody listens. So, why is he out here? Actually, he was the chief executive officer of the city, as I said, under the proconsul. When he appeared, the people listened, allowing him to restore a certain amount of peace and normalcy to the crowd. He makes 4 points in his address in the assembly. Number one, there is no danger whatsoever that the people would conclude that Artemis was a goddess made with hands, since everyone knew that the image had fallen from the sky. And he says Jupiter, and how they ever knew that it was from Jupiter, I don't know. But apparently there was something that they had seen. They had decided that this was a goddess. They gave it the name Artemis, and they worshipped it. Now, since this was known, why should they carry on so? They needed to calm down and not do anything rash that they might later regret. In verse 37, for you have brought hither these men which are neither robbers of churches. Now, what is he talking about when he says robbers of churches here? Now, as I said, this one is a different Greek word with a different meaning. Nor yet blasphemers of your goddess. Wherefore, if Demetrius and the craftsmen which are with him have a matter against any man, the law is open, and there are deputies. Let them plead one another. But if you inquire anything concerning other matters, it shall be determined in a lawful assembly. Now, number 2, he tells the crowd that neither Gaius nor Aristarchus is guilty of any crime worthy of punishment. They have neither plundered the temple of Artemis, nor have they spoken against the goddess. Now, what he is talking about, in a way, yes, they did, but they had never explicitly mentioned the temple. Now, we know, of course, that idol worship in general has been condemned, but nothing explicitly against the temple of Artemis. The Greek word translated churches here in verse 37, as I said, is different from that which we usually think. This Greek word here means a temple despoiler, as the way that Strong defines it. Garth L. Reese notes this. In the 1600s, church was a word used for pagan temples as often as we use the word to talk about Christian buildings. Paul did perform miracles showing their idol worship to be second-rate in comparison to Christianity, and every effort possible made to turn the people from idol worship. And he drives home the principle, gods made with hands are no gods at all, which challenged the very foundation of such pagan worship. And the third point, the town clerk further reminds them that if Demetrius and the craftsmen had a charge against any man, there were proper channels they could go go to accommodate their complaints. Now, here's what I find interesting. He just didn't talk to the crowd generally over everybody, but he specifically mentions Demetrius. And that's going to be important later on, as we'll notice in a minute. He knows who is instigating this. He knows who started the trouble. Now, he says, let them implead one another. It comes from a Greek word means to call in or as a debt or demand. In other words, bring to account, to charge, or to criminate is the way that Strong defines it. The town clerk's call is for the legal system to be respected. If they have a complaint, to use the legal system. Now, the town clerk also recognized that there might be matters of the public rather than personal interest, in which case the public assembly, rather than the courts or the proconsul, was the place to handle it. Now, that also should be settled in a lawful manner, no matter what they did, according to laws, the way they should handle it. The lawful assemblies were regularly scheduled, and at this time, resolutions could be introduced and voted upon, and action taken on various civic and community problems. So, what is the final solution? Beginning with verse 40. For we are in danger to be called in question for this day's uproar, there being no cause whereby we may give an account of this concourse. And when he had thus spoken, he dismissed the assembly. Here's the fourth point. As we have already noted, this assembly had not been convened legally. And as a result, they could be politically implicated from the Roman government. Now, here's where it becomes important about Demetrius being called out. Because guess who they're going to go after? They're going to go after him for certain. Now, Roman law made it a capital offense for anyone to be engaged in promoting a riot. They did not mind letting local people control their affairs as long as they did so peaceably. However, when a violence broke out, and especially involved a large number of people, the soldiers would become involved. And that's something you did not want, is the soldiers becoming policemen because they did carry swords for no reason. Because of these arguments, the mob disperses without further chaos. Now, here's my question. There are no beatings or martyrs at this time. Yet, as we have gone through Acts, we find one after another. Paul's had to escape for his life. Stephen was beaten, different things like this. But there's no martyrs here. And that question I ask you, do you think that we can take and see God's providential hand in this occasion? In conclusion tonight, we have seen that persecution from Gentiles is recorded only twice in the book of Acts. Here and also under with the girl that had the spirit of divination. In this case, no physical harm was the result. Now, the key events that took place in Ephesus, Paul finds 12 disciples of John the Baptist who were ignorant of the baptism in the name of Christ or by the authority of Christ. For 3 months, Paul preached in the synagogue, which resulted in having to move out of the synagogue and go into the school of Tyrannus, where he preached for 2 years. The impact of Paul's work in Ephesus was that all who dwelt in Asia heard the word of the Lord Jesus, both Jew and Gentile. Paul's miracles and preaching led to the rejection of the magical arts and burning of the books of magic. Unfortunately, Paul's preaching also led to a riot instigated by Demetrius and other craftsmen of the city. When we turn to chapter 20, we will see further travels and preaching by Paul and those who were working with him. Other helpers that before have not been mentioned, we will find mentioned there. We will notice a long service at Troas that is followed by a resurrection. And then, sadly to say, a farewell address to the Ephesian elders. Now again, remember, Ephesus is one generation later. It's going to, when God writes, or Jesus writes through John a letter to them, he is not overly happy with what has happened to them by that time. At this time, we will take it open the service to any man that wants to ask a question or make a comment. Okay.
Appreciate your comments. Verse 37 is one thing that stood out to me as I studied this, where he says the town clerk talking to Demetrius about what Paul had done in his teaching, said, "For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples or blasphemers of our goddess." I found that interesting because to me that spoke to the fact that Paul was teaching the truth, but he was not doing it in a way to be personally offensive to these people, not passing judgment upon them. He was just simply teaching the truth. And by them hearing the truth, their own hearts were convicted because they see it applied to them. And I think that's what we're called to do today. We're not to be social reformers to go out and try and right every wrong and call out every evil in society around us, but to simply declare the truth. And evil itself, in practice, will be condemned in the hearts of those, who are participating in it, just like this man Demetrius here. Because if that wasn't true, what he said there, that would have been disputed by Demetrius and stuff. But it was pretty obvious what Paul believed, but he didn't. He stopped short of condemning these men for their practicing these idols and such. And I just thought that was very interesting. I hadn't realized that. That stood out to me before studying this chapter. Thank you, Joe.
Okay, when you read verse 23, something came to my mind from the times that I've read the book of Acts. The very last word, the way, it says, about that time there arose a great commotion about the way. Now the word way is uppercase, W-A-Y. Now, as you read through the book of Acts, now I don't think I had this one down, Acts 19 and 23, but I had 5 other ones down where they called it the way. Even in Saul's conversion, and that's the 9th chapter, I'll just read the 2nd verse. It said, and he asked for the letters from the synagogue of Damascus, so if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he could bound them and bring them back to Jerusalem. But the way is the way early Christians identified themselves. It was Jesus who said in his ministry of John 14, verse 6, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So the way is a way Christians identified. And I looked up several different ones while I'm sitting here. The way of Jesus, committed to Jesus, in different ways that people identified they were followers of him. Now we know, as we studied a number of weeks ago in Acts 11, the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. So eventually they all obviously began to be identified as Christians. But I have the 5 or 6, actually 6 down in Acts 19 written down because that's really a very interesting point that all through Acts, even Felix, when he was being rebuked and trying to be converted, he was being converted to the way. So just pointing, identifying that it's one of the earliest names given to Christians and to what they stood for, which is what Jesus had preached during his ministry.
Yes. As you point out there, it's not only the Christians, but this is non-Christians that are identifying. They clearly were teaching it where other people understood. This way is not idolatrous. This is not your way. This is the way by the Christ.
Thank you very much. Wonderful lesson.
Anybody else? We've still got 5 minutes.